Hello, and welcome back to the Product Builders Podcast. This is your host, Mark Garcia. Today, I've got my co host, Sean O'Shea, joining the conversation, and special guest, Colin Bielen, the VP of Engineering at CBS Media Ventures. Colin, thanks so much for joining us today. How's everything going?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have this talk with you. To get things going, would love to have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Like you said, my name is Colin Bielen. I'm the VP of Engineering for CBS Media Ventures, part of CBS, which is part of Paramount. So we all roll up to Paramount Global. I've been doing this since 2017, having a lot of fun here. It's a great team. Before that, I was at NBC. And before that, I was part of Comcast. And then before that, I was part of E! Entertainment. And before that, I did some startup work way back in the day. So I kind of came up from engineering and still doing it, just with kind of bigger teams and bigger tools.
Great. And that's actually a perfect segue into my first question. Before we dive into your work at where you currently are, I'd love if you can talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today and your evolution from, I guess, working in engineering to everything that you do now.
Yeah. So, I started way back in, Web 1.0. I found my first kind of job out of college. In college, I worked the library shift at night. And this is when kind of HTML was the new thing. And I had some friends who were into that. So we started doing our own little web pages overnight in the graveyard shift. And that turned out to be the most marketable skill I had coming out of college. I was an art history major, so I had big designs on working in information science and things like that. But at the time, everyone wanted a web page, so I found a job over in Santa Monica doing that with a great group of people who have gone on to do some really good things. We built websites for a lot of gaming companies, a couple. Kind of like what are they? They weren't quite e-commerce, but they were wanting to sell things. So e-commerce wasn't really a thing. I could talk about that later, but we sort of ended up building a lot of our own systems, and I think that kind of put the build it culture in me from the earliest points in my career. But then that sort of the dot-com boom kind of boomed, and then people weren't hiring. I ended up at a job at E! Entertainment where we were, part of my job was to help, with their web efforts and, some of their content systems. And, soon after I got there, a lot of their vendors were kind of going out of business because, like I said, this is 2000, 2001. And, in one instance, they literally sort of just dropped some source code and said, "We are out of business, you're on your own." So, we ended up building, media and a few kind of really early e-commerce systems from scratch. We had a really good, VP of tech, CTO there that was, also from that kind of culture. So we kind of did it ourselves. And then, as the company matured, there were things like just the scale of the number of people involved, the number of users you had, compliance issues started to sneak in. And then by the time it was kind of weird. Comcast bought NBC, but because we were the entertainment group, they moved us under NBC. So we kind of bought them, but they moved us under them. And there was a lot of just shuffling going on there. But we actually netted out in a place under NBC Universal Studio System. So we were doing content systems for that, a lot of video distribution, a lot of the workflow kind of things, also some web work. But, most of the heavy engineering was involved in, integration, things like that. And then, I got a great opportunity at CBS, moved over, and I've been doing that pretty much ever since. So I kind of went from, HTML developer to backend Perl developer because it was, 2002, into Java, into, enterprise Java, Rails, PHP. So I'm kind of going the whole circle here. And, after a while, you start to realize that, the language is a language, and it's, the frameworks or frameworks come and go, and you're sort of solving similar kinds of problems. Never the same, but they kind of rhyme, right? Like you've done this a few times. It might be a different framework, but here I am doing that with larger tools and larger teams.
That's awesome. You have certainly covered the spectrum of all things on the engineering side. It sounds like, and it's really interesting to hear about people's backgrounds because everyone I speak to comes from such different places. So that's awesome. Can you go in a little bit into what your day to day looks like now? What are your responsibilities? What types of projects are you working on at CBS Media Ventures?
Yeah, I mean, my day to day, I'm running teams now. So I run, the engineering team. We have a QA team, a small PMO group, small DevOps group. So we're our own little business unit, um, within CBS and within Paramount. I do have peers in other business units. It's behind the scenes, it's very collaborative. So there's a lot of kind of people checking in on each other, and are we doing this the right way? And what are you guys doing over here? And it's I would say probably one of the least siloed places I've worked in terms of collaboration. So that's been fun. Honestly, my day to day is keeping up with stuff like that. Making sure the engineering teams are focused on the right things. There's always this kind of tension between engineering and product. Like we want this thing, but we want it done right. But where's the happy medium? So that's a natural tension that we just sort of work through, and it's fine. That's how work works. Um, but these are small teams, so we're trying to get the most value out of them while keeping it sustainable. I don't want to burn anybody out. We haven't had too many like crazy projects like overnighters happen outside of production issues in several years, so I think that's a good thing. Um, so yeah, basically just managing those teams, and then looking to where we need to shift. Like we've sort of when I started here, it was all about monetizing web content, and we were really set up to optimize that and do well. And now, Paramount, by and large, has said we're deep into streaming, and you read the headlines, and that's all we talk about. So, we're saying, okay, we've got footprints there too. How do we, optimize those better and plug them into the rest of the stuff we're doing here? So figuring those things out, we have some great ideas. We have very creative um, product leaders and problem solvers here. So just really keeping up with those guys, and kind of keeping it agile. Like we still like to beat the agile drum, and we're in 2 week sprints. And what's the sweet spot between like a proof of concept and a finished feature that we can go out and show people. Just kind of keeping that tension going.
That's great. And so I know outside of the streaming, one of the things that you had mentioned to us and that we were really interested in was the fact that you also build teams for your internal team. Is that correct?
We build systems for internal teams. Yeah, we've done that here. I've done it at NBC. So these are kind of like workflow systems on the back end that are kind of niche to the industry, but kind of similar to you know a media system at one place is going to be kind of similar to a media system at another in a lot of ways. But yeah, that's a thing where there's a lot of like large solutions out there that cost a lot of money that can be kind of cumbersome to integrate. So there's value in um, ruling your own, and sometimes that can just be a proof of concept that just never dies to something you do for a year and a half while you're trying to figure out what you really want to do, and maybe there's another system out there that you're looking at, but you're not sure it's a fit, but you have to put something in production. Or it could be, hey, we bought a thing that because we had to get up and running quickly, but it's just not, it's an integration nightmare. Or there's other issues with it, and maybe we need to look how to pull this in house. So we've kind of asked all those questions. I've asked all those questions, for the last 10 years.
I mean, yeah, as an agency, of course, we build products, and a lot of our client base are the kind of enterprise clientele where they are trying to build internal tools to build efficiency. And a lot of conversations we have are the build versus buy conversation, right? So, do we spend the money to integrate and implement and bring on an existing platform, or do we spend the money and create, like you said, a proof of concept that is much more specific, much more niche, but actually accomplishes what we need to get done faster. So that's really cool. I know Sean wanted to dig into this build versus buy mentality. So Sean, I know you had some questions to throw out there.
Yeah, Mark just laid down the groundwork there. But high level, I guess, what are the kind of the initial bullet points I would say that you like to look for in terms of vetting a potential SaaS product versus building it, or building similar features that are needed based off of product scope?
What are the things I look for? I mean, sometimes I think the first one is just how fast do you need it, and I don't mean that in a like slipshod way. I mean that like, is there a workflow we're supporting that is just insanely manual right now, and we have line producers coming in at weird hours to duplicate things because there's multiple play out things that have to be accomplished, and if there's things like that, that can certainly factor into it, because sometimes what you really want is a stopgap just to have breathing room. And that's something I found internal teams can do pretty quickly, just because we control them, and we kind of set the priorities. So if we have to shelve a different project to kind of get something up in a couple of weeks, that can happen. I mean, I think when you do that, it's important to have you kind of limit your scope to what you're doing. Otherwise, I've seen it happen where stopgaps become the thing that occupies the entire engineering team for a year, because, oh, we're here now, we also need this thing and also need this thing. So you kind of have to manage that scope also as you would any other project. I mean, if you throw an engineer on it blindly, they might go down a rabbit hole and you might never see them for a year or two. So that's one piece. I mean, but I've seen it go the other way too. I've seen it where we said, look, we need a thing that does this, and that's not something our team does. It's not a core competency. Sometimes it's not even you got to ask yourself, is this a core competency of the group? Is this something that we want to be good at? So like, for my team, I know we do a lot of integration work with third parties because, like I said, we're a small team. We don't need to be the forefront experts in, recommendation engine theory. We should have ways to integrate those, and we should be really good at integrating those. But like, I don't think we need to, do we really want to spend time rolling our own when there's so many out there? We could. We have good internal teams outside of my group that can do things like that. But you kind of got to ask yourself, is that the competitive advantage we have in our team? Like, what do we want to be good at? And sometimes I've heard it mentioned, like, I forget who said it, but like sometimes you have to decide what you want to be bad at. Like, hey, we're not going to go this way because this is where our focus is. And yeah, we spend some time thinking about that. I mean, okay, what things should we be really good at here? And are we good at those? So those are a couple of things. I will say as I probably told you, you could probably guess, I'm kind of I default to build it, just coming from engineering. I look at something, I'm like, oh, that could just be this kind of thing. That's, we could throw something like that together. And sometimes that works. It's when it's done and in production and you now need to maintain it that becomes an issue, because, I will say the same thing in 3 weeks when someone else says, hey, what about this thing? And I'll say, oh yeah, we could just do this, but my team is, launching this other thing and supporting it now, and there's a cost there because someone has to maintain it. So those are the things I think about when we're doing like a build it versus buy. And then, for large systems, we do a formal, we have the user stories in a spreadsheet, and each vendor's lined up, and all right, on a scale of 1 to 5, how good do we think this is, and we add them all up and do that kind of matrix. And we've done that too for large projects. But usually by the time they're that large, just given the size of my team, it's not something we build internally.
Great answer. You kind of got into my follow-up question. Have you ever regretted building something that you could have bought? Anything specific that comes to mind?
Have I ever regretted building something we could have bought? Nothing comes to mind at my current job. It's funny because of all the things we've built, usually why we stop building them is because I was on a kind of a platform team at one of my earlier jobs where we sort of decided to be the internal solution for the company. But you realize that when you scale to a certain size and your feature set and your user base, you're competing with commercial solutions that are kind of outside your group's core of competency. And they say, look, are we a company that makes this, or are we a company that does stuff and uses this as a tool? And so a lot of times the arguments came down to that. Let's see, did I ever regret? We did way back in the day, like I said, one of our vendors just ended up, I think, dropping a database on us and saying, we're out of business. You guys are on your own. And it was a shop system. I mean, nothing like any commerce system today. It was kind of a homegrown thing. And we sort of had to reverse engineer that and figure that out. And I guess eventually we did sunset that finally, due to compliance issues and things like that. But I have a flip side to that. I do have an example of something that I think we should have outsourced or bought, but we didn't. And it actually turned out well, I think. It was one of the last projects I did as like what do you call it? Like an individual contributor where I coded the whole thing myself. It was a long time ago. It was probably 2001. It took about 3 weeks to code. It was written in Perl, so that's how old this thing was. Took about 3 or 4 weeks to build. There was about 6 to 8 weeks of like post-launch support because we didn't have a spec. This was literally a proof of concept that grew, into something that people started using, and then everybody had requirements. And then it sort of tapered off, and we didn't hear about it. We got maybe an update request every 2 or 3 years. And I always thought, this is a stopgap. Let's just, we'll find something better, because this was it was a scheduling app for news bookings, way before like Google Calendar or anything like that. Like, I think its biggest feature was it could link, if you put an address in, it could look it up on MapQuest for you. Like, that's how old this was. And after several years, like, nobody ever wanted any changes. It would just, should we replace this? And the answer was always, no, it's fine. I mean, it's an old system, and like very few people knew how to maintain it after 10 years. But I always thought that's one that we should, there's got to be a better solution for this. And I'm sure there are, but it was like just kind of good enough that nobody wanted to touch it. So that's one I think that we should have probably found a solution, but we didn't. And it's just kind of there. As an engineer, I don't like it because it's so old, and there's never an appetite to go back and like make it better. But in terms of business value, like per line of code, I think that's one of our best savings. So I've mixed feelings about that one. But over time, I think as systems mature and you start, your business pivots, right? Like, I run a team that we're focused on live streaming and video publishing right now. The systems we built before that were focused on other things were awesome for what they did, but now it's like, okay, now that's actually kind of a hindrance because we have to maintain them, right? Or we have to do something. So there's this period of like, what I try to do is say, okay, this thing's in production now. Make sure it's easy to maintain, because the last thing we want to do is have to go back and fix it when we're doing this other thing. So I think that's a piece that I think about also.
That's awesome. And you mentioned business value. So I'm curious to hear your experience with executive buy-in. So from the agency side, as external developers who also work with enterprise type clients building these internal tools, we found that, getting everyone on board into building a tool that is strictly internal, that one team is going to use, can often be the hardest part of actually building that tool. So what are your thoughts when you come across a platform, an idea that you want to build for your team, and having everyone on board be okay with spending that time there and building that internally versus buying something that's already pre-canned but might not fit 100% what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I've done both. I think, let's see. I think to answer the first question, one thing I look for is, the first thing I always look for is, okay, if this is a solution that we're building, or we're hiring a group to build for us, that also happens. Is it in a tech stack, or is it at a level that the internal team can understand? Right? Like, is it a tech stack we're familiar with? Is it one that, like, if we had to do iterations on this later, we could? Because for the most part, what'll happen is, depending on the system, like some systems like finance, there's a lot of rules and things where we've had just vendors come in and do it as they need it. But for a lot of our core kind of systems that we do, there'll be a period where we need a feature or a component or maybe a new thing kind of built up. And then we have to look at that and say, okay, when this is done, is this going to be something that our team can figure out? And sometimes the answer is no. And then we have to answer for that. It's like, okay, is that something we can train up for? Or is that, usually the answer needs to be, it has to be something we can live with, right? Because we don't want us to have to be going out to a vendor to do certain things. So that's one piece. Or if we do go out to the vendor, we have to know that in advance. Like, hey, this is great, but no one in here knows this, and there's no appetite for us to have an internal team to support this. So basically, every change request has to go out to these guys. And then you have your vendor problem, right? Like, is that vendor always going to be your vendor for that? Is that something that only they know? Is that their proprietary system, and is that what you're actually paying for? Or are you paying for a system that you own that these guys are just coming in and making tweaks on? So you have to kind of be clear on what the relationship is before you start, I guess. Is how I would put that. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry. I think I only answered the first part.
I think it was just getting the full team on board, right? I'm sure there's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different individual contributors, user groups, user types that all need to agree to this system. So how do you get everyone on board with building versus buying?
I mean, the first thing you have to do is get everyone to agree get them on the same page of the problem they're trying to solve, right? Like, because a lot of times, especially if it's a bot system, it can do very many things, and it probably does more than you really need it to. So we don't want people to get lost thinking, okay, this thing's going to solve this, but that's not a problem I care about, so why does that matter? So I think, and that's why this is something our product team's really good at, is saying, okay, this is there's a solution here. It can do all these things, but this is the real thing. This is really what we're evaluating things on. So this is these are the pain points that we want to address. And that can save a lot of confusion and tense meetings down the line, just because you don't have these, oh, I thought we were doing this, or I thought, it basically establishes a vision right away. And then honestly, sometimes people are just not, you get the people who are not into the vision right away. So you'll have some people that might not be paying attention, or some stakeholders that might think it's, this is really about something else, so I'm not going to pay attention. But if you're kind of defining, here's what we're solving and here's what we're not solving for, I think that gets your stakeholder group on the same page earlier rather than later. So that's important. And then I think that's great. You can also use that when going out to vendors or your internal team and saying, okay, here's what we really care about. It's great your thing can do all this, but we don't care. Or we don't care right now. Or it's not important to us now. There's probably a better way you could word it, but that's what you're saying eventually. So just having that kind of clarity is really helpful. And then, if you're on the flip side of that and you say, hey, I really want to build this thing, or I really want them to use this, kind of product or thing that I like, as an internal, as engineering, we are also stakeholders, right? So there can be technical reasons to prefer something versus something else. And that often doesn't always show up in a comparison chart. So I try to have some sort of communicate about that, or sort of preference out as we do these things of like, hey, from an integration standpoint, this solution's better. This one is going to be problematic for a lot of reasons, and this one's a completely different stack. So, happy to explore it, but just know your operational costs are going to be high because of that.
Awesome. Sean, do you have any other follow-up questions?
Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of what you're thinking about for the future. Like, what do you think engineering teams are going to face in the future over the next few years, and how are you going to prepare for like any new changes, whether it's AI, ChatGPT, like any other maybe buzzword or buzz-like technologies?
Yeah, I mean, chat's getting a big. There's a lot of talk right now, and we're looking. I mean. It's so with engineering, I mean, you can look at it as it's interesting, because on some levels it's a cost, and you're like, okay, by the time we get our engineers in here, I mean, that's an expensive resource, so we should be pretty sure about what we're doing. that's one theory. That's one way to look at it. The other way is like, hey, there's a bunch of stuff here. We don't really know what's going on. We need to kind of go poke and explore a few things. So, I mean, one thing I try to do is keep my teams on the proactive side of that, of like, let's not wait until someone has an idea, because once they do, it's going to be, you don't want it to reduce to just an exercise in how fast can you do this, because then you're back to a spec. And honestly, by then, the opportunity might pass, right? It might be too late. So, I try to keep the teams forward looking. I have really supportive management here who's into that and buys into it, which is key. And yeah, I mean, we're looking at solving problems now, but also looking at things that I feel like we're in a place right now where there's a lot of solutions to problems we're not sure if we have yet. Right? Like that's what I see in a lot of ChatGPT stuff. Hey, you can solve these problems. I'm like, okay, do we really have those problems? I'm sure we do, but is that our biggest problem? So there's a lot of, discussion around that. Like I think in this team, as the teams mature, what I do see a lot more of is discussion versus hands-on keyboard coding, which I think is good because the talk is cheap, and I think that's a good thing, because by the time it's coded and you have unit tests written for it and it's out getting ready to release, like to have to pivot there is time consuming and expensive and frustrating versus just sort of doing it earlier, when you can talk these things through or vet ideas, or even whip up quick proofs of concept that can grow or not. Like sometimes they just go away. So that's kind of one thing. Like put it more in the kind of business development world of like, hey, we tried this thing. Like our content teams do this all the time. Hey, we tried this new way to do this content and it worked or it didn't. And if it didn't work, no one's like, oh my God, you guys, you wasted all this time and effort doing this stuff. It's like, no, we tried something and it didn't work, so we'll try something else. And I think keeping that mentality in an engineering team and a product team is can be challenging when when you're trying to optimize and get stuff done. But you have to kind of know that you take it seriously and do good work, but also know we could change. Our direction could pivot without much warning or without much foreknowledge. Right? It might change next sprint just for various reasons. So staying flexible like that, really. What's the saying? Fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Like, don't. I had a really hard time earlier in my career. As a build it guy, it sucked when they wanted to do another system, or when like, oh, things are just not scaling. But guess what? We don't have the capacity to. You're not giving me the tools or the people to make this better. And it's like, no, we're not. It's not a huge priority for the business. It's like, okay, great. So that was some learning that was hard on me when I had to go through that. So I try to keep the teams focused on that, so they don't feel that way.
Yeah, well said. I think a lot of companies are trying to like retrofit some new technology where, as you said, there may not be a problem for it, and they're trying to build it, kind of go backwards and put a solution together for something that's not actually a problem. So going a bit deeper, I'd love to hear more about like what do you think is your like biggest lesson you learned, or biggest failure from lesson you learned from a failure?
I mean, the biggest lesson I've learned probably is that it's not the end. And I just kind of talked about this of like, when you go from a engineering lead who builds it all and is awesome and is now in a position where there's been a reorg and the new CTO is like, I'm going to buy this whenever I can because we got a lot to do. My biggest lesson was from a boss I had at the time who I didn't really take it to heat at the time, but I think I was probably complaining about, we've got all these people doing this kind of stuff and we're just throwing it away for this other thing, and like it feels like a waste. And he kind of just looked at me and said, like, look, the work we're doing here is solving the problems. Like, the engineering team, the tech teams, the product teams, they're solving problems. They're not, we're not, I forget his exact words, but he says, I'm not paying them for lines of code in a certain language. And, I kind of huffed off and said, but like that actually was was a pretty good like reset of my brain when I'm faced with that. I've also been on the side of early in my career. We were a boutique web shop, and we did make these solutions, and we had some fun tools that we tried to open source, and but invariably this was web one, so everybody had their website and their commerce system and their content management system, and come 2001, hey, we're going to take this internally now. Thanks for building it. This is good enough. We're good. And I'm like, no, there's so much more we could do. So I've been on the flip side of that too. And again, I think his advice was still like, you're solving the problem, and if the problem is solved, then they're not going to really need it anymore. So, the good news is there's always more problems, right? So I think that's what I've learned as I've lived through systems. And actually, one of the leaders of the central team here had it pretty well. She said it was a mission statement. I forget where it was. It was a mission statement for their group or something. And she said, we're gonna, we support these products and services for as long as we need to for the business. So like there was this idea of like, it's important now, do it well, but critically reevaluate. And at some point, there might be something else, and that's okay. And that stuck with me because it's the same kind of idea, right? That you're not defining your worth to the company or to anything by the thing you're building right now. So if that thing were to go away, would your team or your group or yourself still have value? And the answer is yes. You just don't always notice it.
We have a lot of these conversations with other leaders in the space, and I think a theme that is that we can see consistently when talking to people is this idea of focusing on the problem and also realizing it's not the end when you fail, right? And actually, you can learn a lot more through a failure than you can from just succeeding right off the bat. So that's really great insight. On that note, is there any other advice you have for engineer leaders like you who are struggling with teams and this build versus buy mentality? Any advice you could share with them or tips that you might impart from your experience?
I guess for build versus buy, if that's the question, I would say a lot of it comes down to time horizon. But kind of ask yourself, what's the core competency of what should be the core competency of the team? So is it, we want to be the best at this, and is the thing, if we were to be the best at this thing, at this feature, whatever it is that something that is defining the product or the enterprise we're working for? So is adding this kind of thing to our feature, is that adding this feature to our system going to make us, is that our secret sauce that makes us better than our competition? Or is it something that is kind of table stakes, like we need this kind of feature because everybody else has it and it would be weird if we didn't? So that, that can kind of gauge how much effort you want to put into something. And if it's secret sauce type stuff, then maybe that's something you keep internally. And the corollary there is sometimes that involves more resources than you might have, but maybe that's something like someone like myself would take to our senior manager and be like, hey, if this is a thing that is, going to be our secret sauce, then we should really invest in it. And that can be a factor in the build versus buy. I think that's a good one. A lot of times the answer is it might not really be a market leading feature. It might just be a thing you need because everyone else has it. And in which case, then it's like, well, is it a big deal, or should, do we just need a table stakes thing we can roll out, and spend 2 weeks on and never touch it again? So, looking at the life of this feature or thing or component or system post launch, like I've built systems that we never really touch again outside of compliance issues. And there are commercial systems that do it better, but it's not worth the effort of going in and changing it all. So probably those two things.
Awesome. And so we are reaching the end of our time here, so I'm going to back this conversation out a little bit. But from a high level, what has been one of the most memorable experiences of your career so far? Any milestones that really stand out to you in the whole span of your career and everything that you've been doing?
I think this is funny, but one that always stood out to me is when my first child was born, I basically had to take several weeks off. And it was a hard out. It wasn't like, hey, I'm checking this might have been before Slack. This is 2010. I'm not checking the pager. I'm not doing anything. And this was a busy environment. Like we were in a place where, some of our apps just weren't performing very well, and there was some on-call issues, and like we had to kind of be around. And I was the stressed out tech lead who kind of was managing it all, and I'm defining my worth by making this thing stand up. And I wasn't there. And my boss was supportive, so she was great. And when I came back, things weren't better, but everyone else stepped up. And it was great because it was something I couldn't get them to do because I was afraid to do it. And that, I didn't realize it until about 6 weeks later, but I'm like, hey, that actually worked pretty well. So now, as I have other teams and I'm have people under me who kind of mature in their careers, I look at that and say, okay, how do I give them the benefit of that without the hard out? Like, how do I ease up just enough to, get them to take the next thing without it being a crisis? So to me, that was a real mindset shift of like, you don't have to be the person doing this all the time. You have to have a team that does it, but you don't have to do that. And it was the first kind of time that I saw that personally happen. So that made a big impact on me. I think that shifted my thinking quite a bit. And then, I'd say the other one is recently, my current general manager is a big fan of like looking outward. He's very optimistic and sees a lot of opportunities everywhere. Coming from engineering, I deal in costs. Like I can tell you how much this will cost because I know how much we pay our engineers and I know how many hours it is and all that. But the value of these things to me has been new. Like how do you quantify that? How do you make that decision? So working with him has been really eye-opening in terms of like, just looking at things that way. And it's helped me because now I can communicate with, others and other peers or other, people on the product side of like, okay, you're talking in terms of value and I'm talking in terms of like, I can speak that language better now. So that's been really helpful too.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer, Colin. That was really great.
I would say one key thing that I kept seeing a pattern is like post-launch of a product, whether you build it or buy it, is the maintenance and who's doing it. And that seems to be a really common theme that came up in every answer. I think
it can be an unpleasant surprise sometimes. And I've seen it on both ends. I've seen it where, oh crap, the engineering team has to build a thing that can maintain all this. And I've also seen, oh, there's no engineering solution for this. Like we just need extra people, and like both are kind of nasty. So know what you're getting into.
Awesome. Well, I know we cover a lot of information in these conversations, so we like to wrap up our episodes with a key takeaway that you'd like our audience to walk away with and absorb from this chat today. We call it our Majestyk Byte. So Colin, can you share with us what your Majestyk Byte would be for our talk today?
Yeah, it might be two things, so we can edit. But I think the first one is, like I said, I think the work we do is really about solving problems. So at the end of the day, make sure we're doing that. And I think the other one is, what's true today might not be true tomorrow. So, it totally makes sense for us to build this thing now because all these reasons. Okay, a year from now, those reasons might not be there anymore. And you might have to critically reevaluate. So, if you build it, wear it lightly. Like, don't be afraid to sort of cast it off. Like, no one's going to ding you for having to shut a system down that you worked hard on. But also, keep it in the back of your mind. Always have that, like, if we were to do this ourselves, we would just need this, this, and this, right? Like, I think there's a good, that's an engineering thing, but I think there's a intrinsic optimism there that I try to keep. And it, just to keep things as simple as possible in terms we can understand.
That is a great bite. And I think whether you work in engineering or whether you work in product at all, that insight can really apply to any specific job or industry. And it's not inclusive of just being on a product team. So thanks for that insight. Where can people go to find out more about you, your company? Is there anywhere we can direct people to?
I'm not on social media much. I mean, I have my LinkedIn profile, which is very terse. I should probably do something about that. I'm not on social media much anymore. I mean, go to Paramount. It's fun. I like working here. Geez, I feel like I should have a better answer for you, but I don't.
No problem. We'll, of course, include links to yourself, your LinkedIn, and your company as well within our podcast. But Colin, thanks so much for your time today. It was really great talking to you and learning more about what you do and having this talk about build versus buy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.